On World Communion Sunday, I wanted to look at the second decade of life in the United Church of Canada, because it was a decade that brought the world's population face to face with one another. It was a painful and difficult decade that challenged the church, but also made us aware of how we supported each other and how much we were connected to each other. Communion is an ancient ritual meal that reminds us of how we are held together. On the first Sunday of each month this year, we're looking at a decade in our history as we anticipate 100 years as the United Church of Canada next June. In this history series, we're looking at four things: church life in the context of Canada's life, Indigenous connections, one publication that the church wanted people to read, and a hymn that was made popular in the decade. The 10th anniversary of the United Church in Canada in 1935 was celebrated at Maple Leaf Gardens, newly constructed. 15,000 people gathered. And it was a positive, joyful gathering celebrating that the church had survived a decade of hard history. Both the new national church and the Canadian economy were in a dire situation. After the stock market crash of 1929, the whole of Canada was struggling with unemployment, homelessness, and poverty. And the new United Church of Canada was $1.6 million in debt. The resource economy, which was the heart of the Canadian economy, was hard and dangerous work, and global markets fell for our resources in mining, in farming, in fishing, and in logging. Some political and social gains were made in this decade as Quebec women joined the women in the rest of the country in being eligible to vote 20 years later. Lydia Gruchy was the first woman ordained in the United Church. Gruchy had been a school teacher, teaching Bible classes and language classes to Hungarian, Ukrainian, and Russian immigrants. She'd finished her theological school and was working in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan as a minister, but it took 10 years of petitions from their church for the United Church to finally grant a woman ordination. At the same time, youth work in the church was taking off. CGIT, Canadian Girls in Training, were developing leadership and mission education for teen girls. And Tuxas Boys and Trail Rangers offered teen boys leadership skills and civic engagement opportunities. But at the same time, the economy was stalled. People were homeless and going hungry. Clergy were collapsing from overwork as disheartened ministers dealt daily with impoverished and desperate parishioners. Churches were doing what they could to address the needs of people in their communities through soup kitchens and clothing drives. They offered hundreds of thousands of meals across the country. But there was also a growing resentment against unemployed men. A minister at First United Church in Vancouver tried to explain the lives of these men who were in a struggle for existence. He advocated for compassion toward people experiencing economic and social displacement. He argued that they were experiencing sorrow, just as Jesus himself was a man of sorrows. Money was tight. Churches were falling apart because no one had money to fix them. Ministers' salaries were cut by a third. So the minimum salary at that point before the cut was $1,250 a year. But $350 went toward the cost of having a car. So you can see here one of the many Bennett buggies, so named after the prime minister of the time, when no one could afford the gas to run their newly purchased vehicles. With increased unemployment and job scarcity, racial intolerance grew, particularly against visible minorities, brown and Asian people, Eastern European people, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Russians, and Jews. There was also a rise in anti-French sentiment. Prime Ministers Mackenzie King and Bennett reacted to public pressure by severely restricting immigration to a narrow range of acceptable applicants. They were those with money, with agricultural skills, or British or American roots. Immigration fell from an average of 126,000 people a year to 16,000. In order to stem the disaster of homeless, unemployed men, labor camps were established in wilderness areas to stop vagrancy and men traveling to get work. The camps required long hours of heavy labor, and they paid 20 cents a day. By the time the camps closed in 1936, 170,000 men had lived and worked in them, providing more than 10 million workdays to the building of Canadian infrastructure. Workers attempted strikes for decent working conditions and wages, but saw no change. In 1935, about 1,000 men peacefully commandeered freight trains in North Vancouver. They dubbed their protest the On to Ottawa Trek. They made stops in Calgary, Medicine Hat, Swift Current, and Moose Jaw, where more men joined their ranks. Their numbers had grown to about double that, about 2,000, by the time they reached Regina in June. Meanwhile, their representatives had gone on to Ottawa to talk to the Prime Minister to negotiate. The Board of Evangelism and Social Service of the United Church sent the Prime Minister a telegram defending the workers as helpless victims of a condition of injustice that calls for redress. The Prime Minister's secretary sent a reply noting that the Prime Minister had said, "Your telegram will give succor and support to those whose declared purpose is the destruction of our present society." Bennett sent the labor negotiators home. A few days later, as the gathering workers in Regina were losing steam and starting to disband, the Prime Minister ordered the RCMP to move on them, and the protesters were violently dispersed in an event that came to be known as the Regina Riot. 2 people were killed, hundreds injured and incarcerated, damage and destruction all over the city. A few days later, the Saskatchewan government paid for rail tickets for everyone to go home. Running through church conversations in all of this time was whether the church was to take part in evangelism or social services, or both. Are we working to change and perfect ourselves or the world? Both were held in tension, and the church refused to divorce evangelism from social service. The church of this decade spoke in favor of the use and availability of contraception, which was still illegal in Canada. It spoke against the rise of anti-Semitism in the culture. It established an emergency fund to help ministers in debt. It started open dialogue with other Christian denominations and even interfaith conversations, which were unheard of at the time. It supported global talks to create a world council of churches across denominational lines and international borders. The Depression actually helped to knit the church together, helping churches to see each other as one family across political divides and regional divides. In terms of Indigenous connections with the church of the era, one of the great callings, despite the cutbacks, was the call to professionals to the adventure of medical lives in the wilderness. The church ran a number of hospitals, particularly associated with Indigenous communities in the prairies and on the West Coast. In its connection with these often isolated communities, people in the church had noticed that the health outcomes were worse for Indigenous people than the rest of the population, particularly dealing with tuberculosis. So nurses and doctors were actively sought to bring their support to these communities. Before the widespread use of antibiotics, they took on the treatment and care for TB, appendicitis, wounds, accidents and infections, dental emergencies. The whooping cough vaccine was available, and in the 40s, tetanus and diphtheria as well. So the catastrophe of the Great Depression would only be relieved by the catastrophe of the Second World War. Canada, through British ties, was involved in that global conflict right from the beginning. We were a country of 11 million people, and 1 million served full-time in the armed forces. Some were abroad, some were at home, training, equipping, and guarding the coastland. Women were called into active service. This is Edna Pratt from the first women recruits in the Air Force. She was in my congregation in Alberta. In her mid-90s, she still marched around town like she was on parade. And she was a force to be reckoned with. People were terrified of her. By the war's end, some 45,000 Canadians had been killed, and another 55,000 had been injured. The deprivations and hardships were shared. Everyone knew someone in the service, whether it was a relative, a beloved school teacher, a neighbor, or a sweetheart. At home, precious foods, metals, and other goods were rationed or collected for the war effort. When the war intensified, conscription was introduced, and many who had entered the service thinking they would only serve from Canada protested being sent overseas. Japanese people were stripped of their assets and property and interned in camps away from cities and coastlines. 21,000 people, and 77% were Canadian citizens. In a further betrayal, an order in council signed in 1943 liquidated all Japanese property that the government had held in protective custody. Homes, farms, businesses, and personal property were sold, and the proceeds were used to pay the costs of detaining the people who had owned them. In addition to the Japanese people, some Italian and German Canadians had to register and report monthly to the government. 3,000 Jewish refugees were interned in camps in Canada. And 27 camps were built to hold German prisoners of war because there was no place in Europe to hold them, so they were sent to Canada to be held here. The United Church was divided in its response to the war. Like everyone else, their loved ones and communities were involved in the war, but there were conscientious objectors saying that meeting violence with more violence was unchristian and that Jesus called us to be peacemakers. Theologically, the church's struggle in this area was in the tension between guiding and modeling a personal moral way of being and addressing struggles and issues in the wider world. And the church walked the line of trying to do both. One of the publications that the church put out at the end of this decade was a little pocketbook of meditations on church membership. It was called God Be in My Life. It was a booklet with readings and questions and affirmations about what it might mean for your life to be a church person, to be a person who'd made a commitment to be connected to God. This little book was published in 1945, right at the close of the Second World War. A war that had seen the destruction of about 60 million people worldwide, 3% of the global population. A war that had laid waste to cities, turned farms and forests to rubble, and seen mass starvation, annihilation, and dislocation. The subtitle of this book was Every Life Needs an Altar and Faith for Testing Times. The people of the world had definitely been through testing times and needed a faith to start them on the road to life again. And an altar is a table where you bring your offering, your sacrifice. In ancient times, it was on the stone altars that sacrifices were burned to God. So the book was designed to help people think about what they would offer to God, a place where they would bring their sacrifice. Every life needs an altar. That generation of people in this part of the world became a generation who were committed to church and society. They were serious about offering themselves and their talents and time to work to make the world better because they had seen some of the worst. They formed service clubs. They worked to build strong institutions, schools, government, libraries, athletic and sports organizations. They volunteered as coaches, leaders, blood donors. They devoted themselves as members of the organizations that they built. After seeing so much destruction, there was a commitment in the world to build, to create and strengthen a world and a life that could be good. Title chapters in the book were things like this: My leisure time, my work, my community, the political system, the nation, the world order. It invited people not to join the church and sit back and relax, but to join the church and propel yourself into thinking about how your life was entwined with the life of God in the world. How what you did and thought about here and in the world made a difference in your own life and in the life of the world. Good title for a book, God Be in My Life. So we're going to sing together a song from that decade, not so much a hymn as a gospel song that talks about God in my life, just a closer walk with thee.